Orders of the day, government orders, government bills, comments.
Commencement of debate at second reading of Bill C-42, Common Sense of Firearms Licensing Act.
Mr. Blaney, seconded by Ms. Bergen, moves that Bill C-42, an act to amend the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code, and to make a related amendment and a consequential amendment to other acts, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. A debate. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you.
Alors, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I am very pleased to rise in the House today to commence debate on Bill C-42, as the Deputy Clerk has just said, which deals with the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. It is an important day today, Mr. Speaker, because this is the first time in close to 20 years that improvements have been made to our licensing system for firearms, and it is high time, I must say. This bill, Mr. Speaker, seeks to bring reforms that will clarify and simplify the delivery of firearms licenses while maintaining the reliability of this system with the primary goal of protecting Canadians' safety. I would now like to describe how this bill will improve our licensing system. Currently, there are two types of firearms licensing available: the possession license and the possession and acquisition license. Now, the possession and acquisition license is the only one available for new firearms owners. That is the one I use myself, and I have since January. I followed a training session, and then I went through different administrative procedures in order to obtain this possession and acquisition license, or as is called, the PAL. So, as its name says, this license allows us to possess and acquire a gun. Now, this the other possession license was created 20 years ago by the Liberal government as a transitional measure for firearms owners who wanted to avoid the authorization regime. Now, the average age of these owners is close to 60 years. They are all experienced and competent people, and they are people who know how to use these firearms and who can also borrow and buy ammunition. So what are we seeking to do with this bill is simply to merge the system, to simplify it, and to combine the two licenses, these two types of licenses, Mr. Speaker, which would entitle some 600,000 owners of firearms who are law-abiding to acquire a firearm. We can understand that after 20 years, it is time to, people might want to renew their firearms. We might remember at the time that this was an initiative that was proposed by the late Jack Layton, who was the former leader of the New Democratic Party.
Secondly, we are addressing a serious issue that impacts every firearm owner. Currently, if an individual makes a paperwork error and does not renew their license on time, they are liable to face a minimum sentence of 3 years in prison. Some people, Mr. Speaker, may be deployed or traveling abroad. They can be under medical treatment and be turned into a criminal overnight because they have not renewed on time their firearm. That is why this bill, Mr. Speaker, puts in place a 6-month grace period at the end of a 5-year license. Soyons clairs, Monsieur le Président.
Let us be clear, Mr. Speaker. This waiting period, this grace period, will not allow the purchase of firearms or ammunition, but it will prevent people from being considered criminals simply because there was an administrative delay in the renewal of that person's license.
Next, continuing in the area of licensing, this legislation will improve the way the authorization to transport system works. And I certainly invite the leader of the second opposition to read the bill so he would not attempt to mislead the House as he has tried to do today. Currently, Mr. Speaker, an authorization to transport is required to take any restricted firearm between the owner's home and another location.
The honourable member for Malpeque is rising on a point of order.
Order, Mr. Speaker.
Order.
The member accused the leader of the third party of misleading the House. Let me spell out to the minister that during the briefing with staff from his office, we received confirmation that easing the transportation regs means the transport between locations other than those.
Order. Yeah, I was waiting to hear whether the honourable member for Malpeque was going on some procedural question there. I think what I heard was that I think the honourable minister mentioned that there was an attempt to. You know, that can be taken any number of different ways, but I think it's sufficiently opaque that that we wouldn't suggest that there was any direct suggestion of any unparliamentary language in that case. So I don't think we've got a point of order in front of us there, and we'll ask the minister to continue. And those other points that the member for Malpeque mentioned, he may be able to bring those up in the course of debate on the question. The honourable minister.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for your decision, and I understand that this time won't be taken from this important time. We have to debate this important bill. And while on my feet, Mr. Speaker, let me clearly reiterate that in no way the way to transport a restricted firearm in this country is impacted by this bill. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what the opposition of the leader of the second opposition has pretended. But as you've mentioned, the truth will prevail, and this is exactly what is happening right here, Mr. Speaker, as I am presenting this bill. So let's get on to this, move on to this bill, and we'll let our little Liberal friend yell over there, and he'll have his time to debate as well. So, Mr. Speaker, I was explaining to you that we have a grace period for law-abiding citizens that after 5 years are willing to renew their license. That's one first improvement of this bill. As I was interrupted, I was also indicating that we are improving the authorization to transport, and I would invite the member to listen, because maybe then there won't be any more attempt to mislead the House, Mr. Speaker. So as I was just saying, currently, an authorization to transport is required to take any restricted firearm between the owner's home and another location. Each and every new location requires a separate form and application, Mr. Speaker. Are we changing the way to transport a restricted firearm in this country, Mr. Speaker? No. But are we cutting into red tape, Mr. Speaker, for law-abiding citizens? Yes, Mr. Speaker. This is exactly what we're doing, Mr. Speaker. So let's have a honest debate here. Let's talk about the truth, about the fact, and about the fact that it is very important, Mr. Speaker, to keep our safeguard, to keep this country safe, and to keep the measure this government is applying to keep Canadians safe. So, Mr. Speaker, you have to know that those I would say this red tape, those papers are not even shared with law enforcement. They are useless. This is a good example of red tape without any added value. And I hope the Liberal, actually, the opposition leader, the critic, will clearly understand what this bill is all about, and then we can have an open and frank discussion. So, Mr. Speaker, this information, as I've just mentioned, not only is not shared with law enforcement, but is second only to the registration of long guns. This process is the clearest example of needless red tape and burdensome paperwork brought in by the former Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. And my question would be at this point in time, Mr. Speaker, what do have the Liberal Party against law-abiding citizens, Mr. Speaker? This is the question I hope the honourable member will be answering as he'll be given the opportunity to speak on that bill, which is bringing cutting red tape while increasing the safety of Canadians, Mr. Speaker. So let me go on, Mr. Speaker, because this is why this bill will eliminate the need to apply for new authorization. new red tape, Mr. Speaker, to transport a firearm for any lawful activity within the province where the firearm owner resides. What are we talking, Mr. Speaker? We are talking to go to a shooting range. We are talking to go to the gunsmiths to have a firearms repaired or fixed, and we are talking, in some cases, to go to some exhibition, Mr. Speaker, where people can exchange and share their views and their passion for their activity. Il est important de rappeler, Monsieur le Président.
It's important to remember, Mr. Speaker, that all restricted weapons have to be transported, unloaded, locked up, and in a closed chest. It is recommended to always transport them in the trunk of a vehicle.
Here, an opportunity to educate my honourable colleague on the other bench, maybe the leader of the second opposition, who maybe have a need to refresh his knowledge on the way to carry a restricted firearm in this country, Mr. Speaker. Let me be clear. This firearm has to be unloaded. It has to be trigger lock. It has to be in a locked case, Mr. Speaker, and preferably in the trunk of the car with an owner of a valid, restricted firearms, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? We will keep this because we feel that this is important, Mr. Speaker, that we keep on the same way, Mr. Speaker. But while doing this, Mr. Speaker, we also feel it is important to cut red tape for those law-abiding citizens, and that's why we are bringing those change forward, Mr. Speaker. Alors, toute personne qui
Any person transporting a restricted weapon must take the most direct route towards their destination, Mr. Speaker. That is what the law currently says. These rules are not changing because they're safe and sensible. They're common sense, Mr. Speaker.
Firearm Licensing Act. What will be eliminated is the needless paperwork that law-abiding sport shooters were previously required to complete in order to engage in their hobby. Mr. Speaker, while the crux of the Common Sense Firearm Licensing Act is, as its name suggests, the licensing of firearms, there are two other important measures tackled by this bill. First, this bill will just simplify the way and make it that this is a federal law, Mr. Speaker, under the criminal code. So isn't it logic that this law be applied the same way across the land? Well, this is what this bill is willing to accomplish while making law enforcer applying the law and legislator setting the rules. So that's how we're gonna, Mr. Speaker, make sure that the authority of the Chief of Firearms Officer is clearly defined in the law so that it is applied in a standardized way, Mr. Speaker, and that there are no discrepancies amongst one region of another. After all, we are the same country, this is the same law, and this is the same criminal code. So, Mr. Speaker, les lois d'armes à feu sont des lois canadiennes.
Firearms laws are Canadian laws, and I firmly believe there has to be a Canadian standard for the implementation or the enforcement of these laws, and that's exactly what this bill is proposing to do, to simplify and make uniform the licensing regime.
Comments today to decisions that created criminals out of law-abiding citizens overnight. Well, Mr. Speaker, many Canadians were shocked to realize that some owner of illegal firearms for years, for decades, were turned into criminal overnight, Mr. Speaker. This is not acceptable. That is why we are addressing this issue in that bill. The Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act will end the ability of the Canadian Firearms Program to make a final decision on reclassification of firearms without an oversight by elected member of parliament. So why are we doing this, Mr. Speaker? Because the law-abiding owner of the Swiss arm and the seized firearm, Mr. Speaker, are law-abiding citizen and should not be treated as criminal. And this is why we are bringing this legislation forward for that specific part. So therefore, the government will have an oversight mechanism for decision on the classification of firearms. And once again, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, these decisions will be taken on the advice of technical experts who are knowledgeable about the workings of firearms. To that end, Mr. Speaker, this is exactly what will happen to the CZ and the Swiss Arm family of rifles to have the original reclassification restored when the bill is proclaimed into law, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, ce sont...
Mr. Speaker, these are important measures to bring common sense back into our firearms policies. And as I said earlier, my first priority is to keep the safety, ensure the safety of Canadian public thanks to sensible policies.
That has been about disarming all Canadians. It was about making hunting and sport shooting so onerous, so filled with time-consuming paperwork that no one would be interested in pursuing these Canadian heritage activities, Mr. Speaker. Many members around here, Mr. Speakers, have grown on a farm or have their parents having grown on a farm or their grandparents having grown on a farm, Mr. Speaker. This was part of their life. This was part of their way of living. And many of our friends and colleagues like hunting, like sport shootings, Mr. Speaker. They are law-abiding citizens, Mr. Speaker. Why should they be ostracized because they are doing those Canadian heritage activities, Mr. Speaker? Well, we have a common sense firearm licensing regime that is there to make sure that they are abiding by the law, but in the meantime, we are cutting into red tape. So that's what this bill is all about. That's what we are seeking to achieve with this bill. Pour s'assurer que tous les nouveaux
to ensure that all new firearms owners have basic information on the safe handling of the firearm, any new owners will be obliged to complete the Canadian Firearms Safety Course and to pass the test. I met with many hunters and organizations, Mr. Speaker, and they said to me that this is absolutely logical. When we want to acquire or possess and handle a gun, that you have some training. Well, today, up until now, that training was not mandatory, and with this bill, we will ensure that mandatory training for the possession, acquisition, or use of a firearm is something mandatory. So that is something that it will not be just paperwork, but it will be just part of the licensing regime. But that's not all, Mr. Speaker. We have another measure that we're putting forward, which will allow police forces to share information concerning investigations of restricted weapons and prohibited weapons that have been illegally imported. So what we're trying to do is that, and we'll want to ensure that illegal guns on our streets that are used to commit crimes be withdrawn from circulation, and that is a component of this bill. And both the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the Border Services Agency are breaking down the silos and so that they can better communicate. And on top of that, Mr. Speaker, we're going to ensure that gun importers will be obliged to report any importing of weapons. This measure will eliminate a loophole that existed in the past and will give an important tool for getting illegal handguns off our streets.
From British Columbia found that thousands of firearms had been diverted to the black market due to this loophole. It's time that we close that information sharing gap exploited by criminals, Mr. Speaker. So I hope the opposition will consider those sound measures in the bill and will certainly be interested in bringing this bill into committee, Mr. Speaker, so we can discuss those very important measures, Mr. Speaker. But that's not all. And I must tell, regarding the import of illegal firearms, that this issue has been raised with me by my provincial counterparts, and I am pleased to address it in this legislation, Mr. Speaker. Alors, nous nous attaquons donc.
And so we therefore are attacking the criminal use of firearms rather than concentrating on those who are law-abiding citizens and, Mr. Speaker, on top of that, who are carrying out these traditional activities. And finally, Mr. Speaker, there's a third measure that seems important to me. We're going to establish bans on the possession of firearms for those who are found guilty of domestic violence. For serious domestic violence, those found guilty will automatically face a lifetime ban on owning a gun. According to a 2013 report measuring violence against women, spouses and partners were the biggest offenders against women.
For eliminating needless red tape while making our gun control regime make good common sense. Alors, soyons clairs, Monsieur le Président.
So let's be clear, Mr. Speaker. In future, if a person is found guilty of domestic violence by indictment, they will automatically have their possession certificate withdrawn.
Civil firearms policies, Mr. Speaker. That is why you see such strong support for this important legislation, Mr. Speaker. We have spoken with people from all walks of life. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud this afternoon to be here with the member for Yorkton Melville, who has been elected in 1983 and has been a strong advocate of law-abiding citizen while making tough sentences for criminals, and is right here with us today. Mr. Speaker, we as a party have abolished the long gun and ineffective gun registry, but we need to do more. We need to do another step. We need to streamline our process, cut into red tape, and still bring some improvement into this bill to make our country safer. This is what this bill has accomplished, and let me tell you that the member for Yorktown Melville has been an incredible advocate for law-abiding firearms owners. This place will lose an excellent legislator when he retires in 2015. En outre, j'aimerais aussi remercier.
Furthermore, I would like to thank the 4 members of the committee who gave, part of my political party, who gave me a great deal of good advice, either former police officers or RCMP officers, as well as the advisory committee, the members of that committee who gave me precious advice and who led me to discover the importance of being careful while handling firearms. And I'm thinking, for example, of Greg Farrant from the Anglers and Hunters of Ontario. And I have no time left? Okay, well, I would just say Alain Cossette of the Quebec Federation of Anglers and Hunters, Tony Bernardo of the Sports Shooting Association, and these are people who ensured that we have arrived here with a balanced bill that strengthens the safety of our country, cuts paperwork, and is best for our country.
For Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his remarks. But I have to say I'm always disappointed when I hear him adopting the rhetoric and the language of the gun lobby. I think it's revealing of who he's talked to before introducing this bill. And even today, the only people he mentions are those who have a direct interest in guns and the members of his own party. So my question to the Minister is, who was consulted before this bill was drafted and presented in the House? And if it's very clear to me that law enforcement weren't consulted until afterwards, but if it's such common sense legislation, then why did he not consult victims groups, including women's groups who work on violence against women? If it's such common sense legislation, why has he not consulted groups working to reduce gun violence on the streets of Montreal and Toronto? If it's such good legislation, why such narrow consultation before it came to this House?
Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Monsieur le Président.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in my speech, I made reference to the studies that clearly demonstrate that violence against women often comes in the domestic area, and there are specific measures in this bill to ensure that people found guilty who are found guilty by indictment of domestic violence will lose their ability to own a gun. And I think that when my colleague looks at the bill more in depth, he'll realize that this bill indeed simplifies the lives of hunters. And my question is, what does he have against anglers and hunters and farmers who use guns to hunt? I ask the question because why complicate their lives? Does he agree that the measures put forward here in terms of importing firearms will reduce the number of illegal weapons on our streets? Does he intend to support the bill? Because what we want through this is to reduce crimes committed by illegal guns while at the same time simplifying measures for law-abiding gun owners.
The honourable member for Malpeque.
Well, there's certainly not much in the bill that will reduce crimes by illegal guns, Mr. Speaker, but I listened closely to the minister's remarks, and I will say there is some things in this bill we like, and there's some things that we don't, and I will be talking about that later. But you know, isn't the real reason? It's interesting. The minister mentioned the member for Yorktown, Melville, but his one of his staff, and I respect the member for Yorktown, Melville immensely, Mr. Speaker, and did work hard here for all those years. But he had an assistant by the name of Dennis Young. And he was he made a statement publicly here lately that about this bill, saying that it leaves us, referring to supporters of the Conservative government and gun owners, leaves us feeling a bit like we're just used for fundraising. And so isn't the real reason why this bill is coming forward? I listened to the minister try and attack the NDP, try and attack the leader, the Liberals, accused the Liberal leader of misleading the House when he wasn't. Isn't the real reason, Mr. Speaker, all about this stuff and Conservative fundraising, and not only Canadian 20s, Mr. Speaker, but American 20s, maybe a little money from the Canadian Rifle Association as well? Isn't that what it's about? To enliven that.
The honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I think we can expect more from the former Solicitor General of our country. Let me clarify a point that seems extremely important today. We have in this country some severe measures regarding the transportation of restricted weapons. In order to transport a restricted weapon in this country, first of all, you have to have a permit for the acquisition and possession thereof. You have to have a secondary training for a restricted weapon. And if you want to go anywhere with this weapon, with this bill, or without it, it would be the same thing. You have to, first of all, ensure that the gun's not loaded. You have to ensure that it is neutralized, and that can be done in various ways. And then it has to be put into a safe case, and it is recommended to put it in the trunk of the car. So none of that changes. So I'm disappointed, Mr. Speaker, because indeed the leader of the second opposition has tried to mislead the House by suggesting that this bill might change that safe way of transporting firearms. That's not true. We'll continue to transport restricted weapons in exactly the same way, but what we're doing is we're cutting back on paperwork and bureaucracy and red tape, but we're keeping exactly the same way of transporting restricted weapons in this country.
Honourable member for Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's an honour for me to get up and ask my colleague, the Minister, a question. Now, Mr. Speaker, we know that originally we had the long gun registry. It was a $2 million registry according to the Liberals, and it turned out to be a $2 billion plus registry. It hurt farmers, Mr. Speaker. It hurt ranchers. It hurt sports shooters. Mr. Speaker, I have a lot of friends back in my riding, in the riding of Medicine Hat, who are passionate, safe gun owners. And this, Mr. Speaker, this bill, I believe, is going to help those individuals. And I would ask the Minister to please add some more comments regarding how this is going to help those hunters, sports shooters, the farmers, and the ranchers in my riding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister for Public Safety.
I thank the member for Medicine Hat, Mr. Speaker, who is doing an outstanding work in this Parliament. And I thank him for his question, Mr. Speaker. And let me answer what is also behind this bill. What we want to do is increase public safety in this country, Mr. Speaker. And I've alluded to those measures we are putting in place, such as mandatory training and reducing domestic violence by removing the firearms license to people recognized guilty of an indictment. But, Mr. Speaker, it is now time that we treat hunters and farmers, sports shooters, and those who possess law-abiding citizens, it's time to treat them with respect and dignity, and it's also time to cut red tape. So what will we do? It will cut red tape, Mr. Speaker. We will simplify the procedure, and we won't turn them into criminal, Mr. Speaker, because a decision has been taken overnight, Mr. Speaker. There will be scrutiny. There will be measures, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that those people are treated as any other Canadian is treated in this country.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Well, thank you very much. And in a few minutes, we'll be given the opportunity to speak on the bill, and there are, of course, some good things there. But I'm concerned that the minister may inadvertently be misleading the House. He says they're not changing anything about the transportation regulations. So I wonder if the minister can tell us if he's talked to the member for Dauphin Swan River Marquette, who put notice today of a private member's bill that he intends to introduce, a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Criminal Code, Firearms, Storage and Transportation. So I'm very concerned about the content of this bill that we're going to see this week, and it'll be coming up in the next round of private members' bills. So the minister's just assured us they're not changing anything. Can he assure me that this private member's bill, that he's talked to this member, and that this will not be altering the transportation and storage regulations? Because he's a member of your caucus, and you said you've consulted the members of your caucus. So did you consult the member for Dauphin Swan River about this attempt to change those requirements?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Well, Mr. Speaker, one thing is certainly going to be sure at the end of this day is that this bill, C-44, the Common Sense Firearm Licensing Act, is keeping the same way to transport a restricted firearms as it is today. And this is the will of the government to continue that way, Mr. Speaker. But let me be very clear, Mr. Speaker. Once again, to carry a restricted firearms, it has to be unloaded, Mr. Speaker. It also has to be trigger lock or neutralized in any other way to do it technically. It has to be in a locker that is safe, in a box that is safe. And hopefully, if we are to travel with it, it has to be in the trunk of a car, and it also has to be with a valid owner of a restricted firearm licensing, Mr. Speaker. And this bill, frankly, is not addressing this. I invite the member, when there will be debate on other private members' bill, to raise this issue. As he knows, these are not the government's bill. What I hope is we're going to have a good discussion on this bill that is going to be being bring up on committee so that we can vote this bill for what it is. It is common sense Firearm Licensing Act that is increasing the safety of this country and keeping law-abiding Canadian without redless paperwork. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Resuming debates, the honourable member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to speak against Bill C-42, the so-called Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. While this is not the most egregious short title assigned by the Conservatives to a bill, even in this session, this bill might better be titled the Special Interest Firearms Licensing Act. What we have before us is a bill which only looks like common sense when viewed from the point of view of the gun lobby. You Democrats believe that public safety must always trump politics when it comes to firearms licensing and regulation. The Conservatives, on the other hand, have been promoting the dangerous ideas of the gun lobby, a small minority of Canadians, and perhaps even a small minority among gun owners. This is the idea that any regulations at all on firearms pit the interests of law-abiding gun owners against the government and the police, and that these regulations amount to nothing more than excessive red tape. You Democrats have a different view, one that clearly puts public safety first. The Conservatives like to pose as the only ones here who understand rural Canada. And let me say, perhaps to the shock and surprise of some, I actually grew up on a farm. My father and his father before him were hunters. Hunters of quail, pheasant, duck, deer, and moose, and all but one of these later graced our table when I was a kid. And I have to say, sometimes there wouldn't have been much on the table without the hunting that went on in my family. I myself learned to shoot at a young age, an age that most now might consider inappropriately young. And yes, my grandpa always kept a shotgun behind the door for scaring away the coyotes, and it must have worked because I never saw any. But this was in the day before those proper storage regulations. And when those came in, he changed his behavior. He did not see it as an unnecessary red tape. He saw it as good advice for keeping his family safe, and the shotgun disappeared from behind the door and into a locked cabinet. Subsequently, I lived in the Northwest Territories as a young adult. I was fresh out of university, and while I was there, I was privileged to go hunting and out on the trap lines with my Denny friends. Though I have to say, by that time, I was not so much a fan of doing the shooting myself. It was a great experience, a great life experience that I had there. None of them regarded safety regulations as red tape. And now I represent a riding that stretches from the Victoria Harbour all the way out to the head of the West Coast Trail at Port Renfrew. So I do know something about law-abiding gun owners, and I know something about communities where hunting is much more than just a prop to use in arguments about gun registration and licensing. When the Conservatives abolished the gun registry, we on this side of the House warned it would be necessary to remain vigilant on the question of gun licensing and gun regulations. We all knew that the gun lobby wouldn't be happy to stop at the abolition of the registry, that they would keep pushing from their U.S.-influenced ideological viewpoint to weaken all the other measures in Canada which place restrictions on firearms in the interest of public safety. Like his gun lobby allies, the Minister of Public Safety has fallen into the habit of using U.S. rhetoric in his comments on firearms. This was never clearer than on July 23, 2014, when the Minister said, and I quote him, "To possess a firearm is a right, and it is a right that comes with responsibilities," end quote. So here we have a Minister of the Crown, one of the government's chief legal ministers, directly contradicting the Supreme Court of Canada. In 1993, the Supreme Court found in a case called Regina versus Hasselwander that, and let me quote the Supreme Court here, "Canadians, unlike Americans, do not have a constitutional right to bear arms. Yeah. Indeed, most Canadians prefer the peace of mind and sense of security derived from the knowledge that possession of automatic weapons is prohibited," end quote. So there's the minister in direct contradiction of the Supreme Court in the rhetoric that he's using around gun licensing. The court couldn't have been more clear, nor could there have been any doubt about the precedent, since the Hasselwander case was precisely about the right to possess automatic weapons. The court later reiterated this point, that in Canada there is no right to own firearms. This was in the 2010 case of Regina versus Montague. And in this case, the Supreme Court refused to hear an appeal against an Ontario Court of Appeal decision rejecting the existence of such a right in Canada. So like their gun lobby colleagues, when they're challenged on the rights question, Conservatives often switch gears and try to argue that gun ownership is somehow a property right. Another right, I would point out, that's not found in the Canadian Constitution. So what the minister's comments last July clearly indicate is that, unfortunately, we have a government who likes to pander to the gun lobby. At least in this case, though, I'd have to say they do so fairly transparently, and they do so in order to generate political support from their base. When the Conservatives made their first appointments to the Firearms Advisory Committee, the committee responsible for advising the minister on firearms regulations, the appointees were drawn entirely from representatives of the gun lobby. It took until 2012 for the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police to prevail on the government to add 3 police chiefs to the 9 gun advocates the government had already placed on the advisory committee.
What an unbalanced view.
And this came only after the committee came forward with a set of extreme recommendations for the government, which included such great ideas as extending ownership licenses to 10 years, and unbelievably a proposal that the police should resell guns which have been seized rather than destroying them, as is now the case. It's hard for me to even imagine the police running a kind of garage sale of seized weapons. This is the kind of recommendations that came from this firearms advisory committee, which was loaded with gun lobby advocates. So when it comes to the specific firearms regulations adopted by the Conservatives, the influence of the gun lobby is quite apparent. In 2011, the Department of Public Safety drafted new regulations for gun shows that would have required things most Canadians would see as common sense. It would have required things like notifying the local police of gun shows to be held in their jurisdiction. That doesn't seem like red tape to me. That seems like common sense. And it would have required the tethering of guns on display at a gun show. Again, if you've ever gone to a cell phone kiosk, you find the cell phones tethered. Why not have this important public safety measure of tethering guns at a gun show? So these gun show regulations were to have been brought into force in 2012. But no, that didn't happen. Instead, the Conservatives junked the proposed regulations altogether after complaints from the gun lobby that these new requirements were too onerous. I guess we should have seen this coming because the Firearms Advisory Committee called for scrapping the gun show regulations in its March 2012 report. So I'm worried about who was consulted, as I said in my question to the minister at the beginning. Who did he talk to? He says he talked to the hunting lobbies. He said he talked to members of his caucus. He probably looked at the reports from the Firearms Advisory Committee. But we see that the slanted kind of approach that's taken there has had an influence on what the minister's already doing. Regulations were also due to come into force in December 2012 to require that each gun manufactured in Canada would have to have an individual serial number. Surprising to me that that's not a requirement, as it's actually something required by the international treaties to which Canada is already a party. And again, it's something that seems like common sense when it comes to the police being able to trace guns used in crimes or in the fight to combat the illegal international arms trade, or the international trade in small arms. In November of 2013, for a second time, the Conservatives quietly implemented a regulation delaying the coming into force of this requirement for serial numbers on each gun manufactured in Canada. This time, they delayed it until December 2015, conveniently after the next scheduled election date. Now, the connection to the gun lobby is not so clear on this regulation, but I have no doubt that that connection exists. Why else would the Conservatives have appointed a representative of the Shooting Sports Association as a member of the Canadian delegation at international arms treaty negotiations?
What?
That's right. You've heard me correctly. A representative of the Sports Shooting Association and a member of the Firearms Advisory Committee became part of the international delegation to debate the Small Arms Trade Treaty internationally. Wow. Now, at a time when 50 other nations have signed the Arms Trade Treaty, why has Canada failed to do so? And why are we excluding ourselves from the important discussions about how to end the illegal arms trade? And the minister, in his speech, made reference to the important role in public safety of stopping smuggling of illegal arms into Canada, yet we've excluded ourselves from the very process that would make that possible. When it comes to Bill C-42, I guess we should be glad the government abandoned the most extreme recommendations of its Firearm Advisory Committee, those I mentioned a minute ago of 10-year licenses and resale of seized weapons. But now we're seeing complaints in the media from the gun lobby that C-42 doesn't go far enough. And so that's why I'm a little worried about the private members bill that was placed on notice today that we will see later this week and how that relates. And the minister can say all he likes that that's a private members bill and nothing to do with him. Well, we'll see. We'll see if it's nothing to do with this bill, but I guess I have to say when I've seen the gun lobbying saying C-42 should have gone farther, I'm very concerned about the contents of this new private members bill. So now, let me turn to the contents of the bill we have in front of us. One which is still clearly a child of the gun lobby. I should point out, as I did in my question to the minister, there's no evidence of broad consultations throughout the community. And if this is such common sense legislation, I don't understand why such a narrow group of people were the only ones consulted on this bill. So for me, despite the short title, there's nothing common sense about the two major provisions in this bill. One of those makes the gun classification process a clearly political process, and the other removes the requirement for having a permit allowing transportation of firearms present in any vehicle carrying them. Neither of these provisions has any public safety purpose, and instead they respond only to the explicit complaints from the gun lobby. All the other things the Conservatives want to address in this bill could be accomplished without these two provisions. So let me discuss the first change that's proposed in the way weapons are classified. Right now, recommendations on classification are under definitions contained in law, and those recommendations are made by firearms experts in the RCMP, who both the gun lobby and the government members have referred to as bureaucrats. These are, in fact, the RCMP firearms experts. The minister's signature is required on any reclassification, but there is no discretion for the minister providing the recommendations fall within the scope of the existing legislative definitions. What Bill C-42 suggests is the Cabinet should be able to ignore the classification recommendations from the public experts and substitute its own wisdom about how weapons should be classified. And the minister's already told us today that when this bill passes, he tends to use this political process to reclassify 2 individual types of guns. So C-42 goes even further in allowing Cabinet to grant exemptions for guns and ammunition which would otherwise have been prohibited by varying the definitions in the legislation. So where did this perceived need for a change come from? It came from the single case of the reclassification of a single weapon, the Swiss Arms PE-90, or classic greens as they are sometimes called. These are military-style weapons which have been sold for nearly 20 years in Canada as a semi-automatic weapon limited to firing 5 rounds. Before 2013, there were approximately 2,000 of these weapons in Canada, worth about $4,000 each. So why the reclassification? What we had in Calgary in 2013 was the sudden appearance of so-called refurbished models of this gun, which were now operating as automatic weapons. These meant that these weapons were now easily converted to automatic weapons capable of firing a long series of shots from a single trigger pull. Exactly what the designation prohibited was designed to keep off the streets in Canada. When there was an immediate outcry from the gun lobby, the Conservatives were quick to grant a 2-year amnesty in March of 2014, an amnesty for which I believe legal authority is doubtful at best. How can the government grant an amnesty on possessing a weapon which is prohibited by law in Canada? But now this government has presented C-42 as the solution, giving the Conservative cabinet the power to decide if these dangerous weapons should be allowed in Canada. And quite apart from the danger of ending up with automatic weapons on the street, there's another principle at stake here. When we make laws, we make them in public, after public debate, and they stay in force until there's another public debate about changing them. Public debate before changing law is essential to democracy and accountability. In fact, what we have in Bill C-42 is the creation of a process whereby Canada can, in effect, change our gun classification system and the classification of individual weapons by making decisions behind closed doors and without any public debate. The other major change in Bill C-42 is removing the requirement which exists in most provinces to have a permit in any vehicle transporting restricted firearms, and the bill goes further, it prohibits any province from reintroducing such a requirement. Currently, permits must specify a reason for transporting the firearm and specify that the travel must be from a specific point A to a specific point B. This makes it easy for the police to enforce the prohibition on the illegal transportation of firearms by providing a specific permit and a specific route. C-42 rolls transportation permits into the license to own firearms. This will automatically allow the transportation of firearms between the owner's home and a list of 5 kinds of places: to any gun range, to any gun shop, to any gun show, to any police station, and to any border post for exiting from Canada. This provides a vast array of excuses for having weapons in a vehicle along a myriad set of plausible routes. And this change will make the prohibition on illegal transportations of weapons virtually impossible for police to enforce. And again, I want to say that's why I'm concerned about the notice the member for Dauphin Swan River Marquette has given about a bill to amend the criminal code on firearms storage and transportation. I'm looking forward to having the opportunity in committee of having law enforcement representatives present so that we can talk to them about the impact of this change of no longer requiring specific permits from a specific place to a specific place for restricted firearms. I think there's a great deal of danger here for Canadians. There are, of course, some other provisions of this bill about which we have some questions. And most of those questions will be about whether those changes, like combining the 2 kinds of licenses and creating a grace period after the expiry of a license, whether these changes will have negative consequences on completing timely checks as to whether owners remain authorized to own firearms after criminal or mental health incidents. We will be asking for assurances from the Minister on these questions in committee. There's nothing more important to public safety than we make sure that the system works so that those who are convicted of criminal activity or those who have experienced mental health difficulties are no longer in possession of firearms. And you have to look no further than this Parliament Hill to understand the importance of those kinds of checks. Now, does anything in this bill look good to New Democrats? The minister was asking me that earlier as a kind of heckle. Certainly, measures which make prohibitions on gun ownership easier in cases of domestic violence are very welcome, as are expanded requirements for gun safety courses. And since there are a couple of positives in this bill, the minister might ask, well, why aren't we trying to improve this bill in committee? Why haven't we said we'll support it at second reading? Now, I have to say, I've become more than a bit cynical about this. On Bill C-44, just last week, the minister assured me we could have full debate in committee on the bill expanding the powers of CSIS. He said it was up to the committee to make its own decision, as if the government doesn't have a majority on every committee, and as if his parliamentary secretary didn't move motions which restrict debate in committee. I mean, it beggars belief that you would make this argument in the House of Commons. But on Bill C-44, where the government said it would like all party support, and where we clearly were told by the minister that the Public Safety Committee was the place for detailed debate, this afternoon, while we're in the House here, the committee is getting its only afternoon with opposition witnesses. It's only 2 hours to discuss the bill that's expanding the powers of CSIS. So that's why, Mr. Minister, even though there are a couple of good things in this bill, I can't argue that we should support the bill to go to committee and try and fix the rest, because the experience again and again we have in committee is limited time, limited witnesses, and the absolute refusal of the government to accept even the best intentioned, even the most non-political amendments from the opposition. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, public safety is not the priority for Conservatives in C-42. In fact, its two main provisions seem to present clear threats to public safety to me. If we have political decisions being made about whether a gun is or is not a prohibited weapon, I don't think that bodes well for future public safety. And if we have this gray area that we've now introduced in terms of transportation of weapons, I don't think that bodes well for public safety. So, Mr. Speaker, let me conclude by saying that I find it both sad and insensitive on the part of the government to be discussing this bill in the lead up to December 6th. This is a national day dedicated to remembering the victims of École Polytechnique massacre 25 years ago, and a day set aside for recommitting to the fight against violence against women. And I do not understand why the Conservatives want to proceed so abruptly with this bill to loosen gun regulations in the aftermath of the murder of Corporal Nathan Cirillo at the War Memorial and the attack here in Parliament. I would ask the government to put off further consideration of this bill until well into the new year, a less emotional time for victims, and to give time for the air to clear after the October 22nd incident here on the Hill. Will the government show more respect for Canadians and our democratic process by delaying this bill? I doubt it. Instead, I expect them to press on to the tune of the dog whistle played by the gun lobby friends of theirs. Unfortunately, I think Canadians already know the answer to this question, Mr. Speaker, that the gun lobby rules and that this bill will press ahead, and that's why, as a New Democrat, I will be proud to vote against Bill C-42.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture.
Why, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to, I guess, make an observation. The observation is that criminals who commit gun-related crimes don't follow the law. And what the Liberals did in their era, Mr. Speaker, is they tried to curtail crime by shackling and burdening law-abiding gun owners. Those would be gun owners who follow the law, like myself, because I'm a gun owner myself, Mr. Speaker, burdening them and shackling them with unnecessary and complicated laws and restrictive laws. Now, the minister has brought about a bill to ease that because they are law-abiding gun owners, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, the NDP have bought into the misguided Liberal logic that somehow criminals follow the law when they don't. So I'm wondering if this member could in fact just agree that criminals don't follow the law and that the intent of this bill is actually to respect law-abiding Canadians and the fact that they are allowed to own guns and they should not be shackled and overburdened, Mr. Speaker, with unnecessary rules, regulations and laws. There have to be a minimum amount in place, but not unduly so, as was presented by the Liberal Party in their day, Mr. Speaker.
For a Esquimalt 1 to Fuca.
Well, I thank the Parliamentary Secretary for his question. I guess I would have to start by saying that everybody's law-abiding until they're not.
And so the question doesn't make much sense to me. It's more of the rhetoric from the gun lobby. Obviously, there are legitimate uses for guns. There are legitimate demands for having guns. If you're a hunter, if you're a sports shooter, we totally accept that on this side of the House. What we're saying is that we have to have reasonable regulations in place to protect public safety. And the first way you have to judge these laws is, do they protect public safety? Not, do you have to fill out forms, right?
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have a question for my honourable friend who we sit in the committee together, and I guess one of the most he raised a number of points in terms of some of the witnesses that we would need to hear from at committee. Canadian firearms officers, police, people who have been involved with transport of guns, etc. One of the difficulties, as we know, and both he and I are missing the debate on C-44 because the government called this bill at the same time. And the problem is, I would wonder what the member's thoughts are, and could he tell Canadians the problem with committees in terms of, yes, we may have this debate in here, it'll likely be closure put on it at some point in time. How is our ability curtailed at committee to hear the proper people we should hear from to deal with this issue? And one of the most important to deal with this issue, Mr. Speaker, is the issue my leader raised in question period, and that is the open-ended transportation of guns. Yes, they had to be in a trunk locked, but as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture said, criminals don't follow the rules. Of course they don't. But if there's guns in trunks of cars, most of the guns criminals use are stolen from legitimate gun owners. And isn't that a problem with the new transport rules?
Member for Esquimalt, Fuca.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, and I guess there's two things there. One I would say is I'm a former municipal police board member, and I've done a lot of international policing work. And it's very rare that you come across police who believe that gun regulations are red tape. Yeah. Police are very supportive of reasonable regulations. They don't want extra forms. They don't want extra time wasted. But reasonable regulations are something that police are quite often in favor of. So I look very much forward to having the time in committee to hear from law enforcement officials on the question of transportation of weapons. However, I have to say, as I did earlier, I've kind of lost my faith that we're going to have adequate time in committees after my experience with C-44. I would ask the minister again, but I know his answer that it has nothing to do with him and his parliamentary secretary and the majority on the committee. It's just out of the air that we get these restrictions on time and the number of witnesses.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Saint-Bruno Saint-Hubert. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Since I was elected, and all Canadians have noticed this Conservative government, it does not govern for Canadians, but rather for its own base. And today with Bill C-42, we realize that the firearms lobby has been working very hard for this. Now, we know that this government did not consult organizations that are tasked with and that there will be changes to public safety, and that is the case in Quebec too. So doesn't my colleague think that Bill C-42 flies in the face of the concept of public safety and citizen safety?
Well, I thank the honourable member for questions, and that's exactly my point, that public safety has to be our first concern in any of the changes that we're making to gun licensing and gun regulation. But I would also like to remind the House that when the gun registry was being eliminated, the Conservatives were saying that's all we need to do. And now here we are with another bill that loosens licensing and regulation. And sometime later this week, we're going to have another private member's bill that says we have to do something else. So we're on a very, I would say it's a slippery slope, but it seems more like an express train to keep making more and more and more changes at the behest of the gun lobby and forgetting the importance of keeping public safety at the center of what we do.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Minister of Public Safety. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech, and I noticed that his family also has roots, like many Canadian families, know how to safely handle firearms. So his former leader, Jack Layton, had proposed measures that are in this bill. That is the merger of the two licenses, that is the PAL and the possession license. So why today are they flip-flopping all of a sudden on a policy that seemed to be their party policy before? Why are they opposed to this specific measure that was advocated by their own former leader? Is it ideological? I would urge my colleague to look at the value of these measures.
For a Swima Wandafuka.
Well, I thank the Honourable Minister of Public Safety for his question, and I appreciate his reference to my family background for once accepting that some people on this side actually have families with similar experience to those from the Conservative side. In regards to why are we changing our position on the bill, what I would have to say is the proof is in the packaging. So our leader may have had an idea or suggestion in the past, but it wasn't this package that the minister is bringing forward. So I've said to him very clearly, there's a couple of things that we like in this bill, but there's some things we're concerned about. And so if you're going to merge those licenses, then we have to have the assurance, right, that there's proper checks for criminal activity, for mental health incidents, for domestic violence in the home. So it's not just a question of picking out one idea and saying, why don't you support this one idea? It's the whole package of measures in this bill that makes it impossible for us to support it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it is worthy in terms of noting that this bill will, in fact, if passed, allow for a more open-ended transportation of firearms, Mr. Speaker. And in Winnipeg, we get actually thousands of vehicles that are stolen every year, a population of 1.25 million people. 1 year, we actually had in excess of 13,000 vehicles stolen. I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that there would be a great deal of concern in regards to that. We know quite often that it's a part of a gang initiation in terms of go out and steal a vehicle. And it seems to me that the government is not dealing with the issue of illegal guns, possession of illegal guns. And I'm wondering if the member might want to provide some comment in regards to that particular issue.
Well, Member for Esquimalt, Wandafuka.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for his question. As I said in my speech, I'm concerned there wasn't a broader range of people consulted about the impacts of this bill, and in particular, in-depth consultations with the law enforcement community on the very questions that he's raising. But there are also many groups working in Montreal and Toronto, in particular, on trying to reduce gun violence on the streets. And I'm very disappointed that the minister clearly hasn't talked to these people about the bill, because the situation of having most guns be stolen is going to become much worse if we loosen the regulations on transportation of weapons. There's just no doubt about that. And so, I look forward to hearing what the minister has to say in committee and hearing from witnesses who represent those other parts of the Canadian society which are also concerned about the presence of guns.
Before we go to resuming debate, it is my duty, pursuant to Standing Order 38, to inform the House that the questions to be raised tonight at the time of adjournment are as follows. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona in respect to the environment, the Honourable Member for Lac St. Louis in regard to health, and the Honourable Member for Algoma, Manitoulin, Kapuskasing in regards to public safety. Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Malpeque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do welcome the opportunity to speak on Bill C-42, an act to amend the Firearms Act and the Criminal Code, and to make related amendments, and make a related amendment and a consequential amendment to other acts. As it states in the bill, the short title it could be called the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. Mr. Speaker, when this government is calling something common sense, as you would well know, Mr. Speaker, when they say common sense, it's time for all of us to look at the fine print. And that's what we're going to do. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to lay out today the position of the Liberal Party on this bill moving to committee. First and foremost, as we know, and I said in the question earlier, the bill is coming forward disguised as a law and order bill, but really is designed to try and reignite the support among those in the pro-gun community for the Conservative base and the Conservative Party. And as such, as we will have already heard, government MPs will try and allege, and we heard it from the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture earlier, that the Liberal Party would bring back that gun registry. Not true. To say so on the part of any speaker, to say so on the part of any speaker from the Conservative camp would be an absolute lie, Mr. Speaker. Right. The leader of the Liberal Party previously and again today has made it clear, made it absolutely clear, to quote the leader, we will, quote, we will not bring back a gun registry, end of quote. It was stated in the past, it was stated in today at a scrum following the a scrum with the media following caucus meeting today. Let me repeat, there seems to be a lot of yelling opposite by government members. They may not like to hear the fact, Mr. Speaker, but the fact of the matter is the Liberal Party stands and the leader has committed. We will, as a Liberal Party and the Liberal leader, will not bring back a gun registry, end of quote. So, to play the gun registry card in Conservative propaganda and in fundraising on the part of the Conservatives would be, as I said earlier, an absolute abrogation of the truth. Indeed, it would be a lie. And so anybody who stands up in this House and says that the Liberal Party is going to bring back the gun registry is lying. And get that straight, Mr. Speaker. So let me turn, Mr. Speaker, to Bill C-42 as proposed. Simply put, there are good points that are helpful to those who use guns in this country. And there are troublesome policy and legislative amendments which will put public safety in Canada at risk. Possibly and definitely, I believe, will make Canadian streets less safe as a result of some of those proposals in Bill C-42. And indeed, put lives at risk, and I would submit would put police officers' lives especially at risk. Therefore, the Liberal Party is asking the Minister and the Government that Bill C-42 be split. Mr. Speaker, we call on the Minister of Public Safety to split C-42. We can support these measures. We can support creating a 6-month grace period at the end of the 5-year license period to stop people from immediately becoming criminalized for paperwork delays around license renewal. That is in Clause 14. We can support streamlining the licensing system by eliminating the possession-only license and converting all existing POLs to possession and acquisition licenses, or PALs. That's in Clause 11. We can support making classroom participation in firearms safety training mandatory for first-time license applicants. That's in Clause 4. And we can support amending the criminal code to strengthen the provisions related to orders prohibiting the possession of firearms where a person is convicted of an offence involving domestic violence. That's in Clause 30. And we can support authorizing firearms import information sharing when restricted and prohibited firearms are imported into Canada by businesses, and that I don't have the list of where that clause is. But, Mr. Speaker, we can support that because it only makes sense. Canada Border Service agencies, that RRC and police forces of other jurisdictions should have that information. Therefore, the clause in short, just to sum up, Mr. Speaker, we therefore call on the Minister of Public Safety to split Bill C-42. We can support several elements, as I said, the provision streamlining license paperwork, tightening safety requirements, making it harder for people convicted of domestic offences to obtain a gun, and firearm information sharing, and extending the grace period to 6 months. Split the bill. Mr. Speaker, split it, assist lawful gun activity activists, sports shooters, farmers and hunters immediately. And if the minister is willing to split the bill, we should be able to accomplish passage in this House of that segment, and I think even the NDP would support some of those aspects. We should be able to accomplish some of those aspects and get the bill through by Christmas, if that is really their desire. So let me now turn, Mr. Speaker, but as we'll find out, the government really isn't interested in helping firearms law-abiding gun owners. They're really interested in creating a fight to leave the impression that we over here on this side of the House, we just don't like those gun owners, law-abiding gun owners. That's the impression they want to leave. So they put in place a bill that has some good aspects in it for the law-abiding gun community, but has a poison pill, and I submit will damage public safety in this country. So, Mr. Speaker, therefore, let me turn to those other aspects of the bill that we cannot support, because it does put public safety in this country at risk. The bill, in short, the bill first, it eliminates the need for owners of prohibited and restricted firearms to have a transportation license to carry these guns in their vehicle. So it eliminates that need for every time you transport. This means they could freely transport handguns or automatic weapons anywhere within their province. And in fact, we know the reality, although they're not supposed to. And in the backgrounder, they can travel with restricted and prohibited firearms for traveling to shooting ranges for practice as a competition, returning to an individual's home following a chief firearms officer approval of transfer of ownership, going to a gunsmith, a gun show, or a Canadian port of exit, going to a peace officer or a CFO for verification, registration, or disposal. There's such a mix of things when you give them the broad transport license, Mr. Speaker. It's an accident waiting to happen. And so, you know, open transport. And of course the guns are going to be locked. There's going to be no weapon in them. These are people who don't want to break the law. But as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Agriculture said earlier, criminals don't abide by the law. And criminals will break into those vehicles. They will take those weapons and they'll use them for wrong purposes. And so the Minister, with this aspect, trying to simplify the system, is actually making the streets more dangerous. So we can't support that part of the bill, Mr. Speaker. Secondly, Bill C-42 would take the power to classify firearms out of the hands of police, the experts in keeping Canadians safe, and put it in the hands of politicians like the current minister, or might even be the member for Yorkton, or it might be somebody else over there at some point in time. But it takes it out of the hands of the police and puts it in the hands of politicians, and I'll speak on that a little more in a moment. And thirdly, it takes the authority away from provincial chief firearms officers and imposes the federal minister's will upon those CFOs in the provinces by regulation. So, on that point, we have to strongly oppose. So let me explain that in a little more detail, Mr. Speaker. The bill will enable the minister to assume the authority to designate firearms which could result in currently designated prohibited and restricted firearms receiving a non-restricted categorization, effectively having an automatic handgun or worse, receiving a designation the equivalent of a shotgun or hunting rifle. I would in fact challenge the Minister for Public Safety to speak to this point. If C-42 passes in its present form, the Conservative Minister of Public Safety will be empowered to designate any prohibited or restricted firearm to that of a non-restricted firearm. This is the conclusion, Mr. Speaker, of the Library of Parliament on their interpretation of C-42, and I quote, Bill C-42 would give the Governor and Council, i.e. the Cabinet, the power to carve out exceptions by way of regulations for firearms that would otherwise fall within the Criminal Code definitions of restricted or prohibited weapons, firearms. This power would allow the Minister to render firearms currently classified as prohibited or restricted firearms, non-restricted firearms, and to render firearms that are currently classified as prohibited firearms, restricted firearms, end of quote. Quite literally, we would have a firearms registration system in Canada which would be open to lobbying, pressure, political favoritism, in short, a corrupted system of firearms classification. This legislation will allow a politician, through the Minister of Public Safety, to override the recommendations of experts within our law enforcement community who have been empowered to determine which firearms should be restricted or prohibited from as easy and ready access as are rifles and shotguns, the firearms of choice for farmers, sport shooters and hunters in Canada. What this minister wants to politicize is unique. From a preliminary examination of other jurisdictions, which included the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia, the United Kingdom and Germany, the Library of Parliament found the following, quote, a review of firearms legislation in several selected countries has not revealed any jurisdiction in which a cabinet, a government department, or even the police have the authority to override the firearms classifications principles set out in the legislation, end of quote. So this is unique. We're politicizing the classification of guns. So the question is, where does the politicization of firearms classification, which will allow Conservative politicians to work toward having full automatic firearms become the equivalent of a shotgun or hunting rifle? On this point, I'm looking forward to hearing from certain members of the Conservative Party, specifically those who in a previous life were frontline police officers, because this clause could, if the minister is pressured, put police officers more at risk than they are today. The primary motivation behind legislation which will empower politicians to classify firearms in Canada began when the RCMP did its duty. As a result, to quote the Montreal Gazette of August 30th this year, quote, the government came under a barrage of criticism after the RCMP firearms program quietly changed the status of Swiss Arms brand rifles and certain Czech-made CZ-858 rifles from restricted or non-restricted to prohibited, end of quote. The Conservative government, beginning with the Minister of Public Safety, lashed out at, quote, unelected bureaucrats for having reclassified those firearms. He even put a press release on the Conservative Party website as the member for Lévis-Bellechasse. He's the minister. He's the minister. He said in his press release, and I quote, that's why, quote, on February 28th, that's why I was troubled to learn of a decision made by unelected bureaucrats He was informed weeks earlier by the RCMP this was going to happen. He's the minister in charge of those unelected bureaucrats. You're either the minister or not. You can't be the minister one day and the MP for a riding the next. The minister should have accepted his responsibility and done his job. If he's got a problem with the RCMP in how they do their job, and they did their job, and he criticized them for doing their job, then he should have tried to fire maybe the commissioner of the RCMP if that's how he felt about it. But that is unbelievable that the minister would actually go that far and attack the very people that he's responsible for in order to cater to the gun lobby in Canada. And the members sit opposite here and heckle me a little bit and say that, gosh, that I might accuse them of politicizing, of facing political pressure and making decisions under political pressure. The evidence is right there. The minister caved into the gun lobby, and he knows it. And that's in part why we got this bill today. You know, Mr. Speaker, what is even more disturbing is that there are media reports that the Prime Minister himself was fully briefed on the need to reclassify these firearms in May 2013, literally 9 months prior to any public statements of reclassification. In short, this government has sent a very strong signal to our frontline police officers and first responders across Canada. If there is any interference with any firearms issue, and we can sense some kind of political advantage, we will overrule every time any decision made on your behalf with your safety and public safety taking a back seat to their political advantage. That's the facts, Mr. Speaker. A second concern, Mr. Speaker, with this legislation is the intention of the government to undermine the work of provincial chief firearms officers in this bill. And I guess part of the reason for that, you know, I have to ask the question, what's the reason for the government challenging or trying to overrule chief firearms officers within the province? And the reason may be that Vivian Hayward, in a Guardian article, said this. Vivian Hayward's the chief firearms officer in PEI, and she said she knows very little about the changes at the point of this article, as the province had not been consulted on the proposed federal Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. But from what she read in media reports, Hayward said she is concerned over the proposed easing of restrictions for firearms transportation. Quote, "It's just basically one step away from the United States style of having a gun on your hip authorization to carry, which people in this country don't have," end of quote, Hayward said. So is that part of the reason why they're coming down hard on provincial chief firearms officers? So, Mr. Speaker, I see I'm running out of time, but let me conclude by saying, Mr. Speaker, there's several good points that I outlined in the bill. We can support them. We can get those aspects through by Christmas if we want to do that. Is the minister willing to split the bill? Let's deal with those issues that benefit the law-abiding gun community, and let's set the other ones aside and have a debate, because those are issues that jeopardize public safety. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to say very clearly that it's thanks to the confidence of the people of Lévis and Bellechasse that I have the privilege of serving here today, and also as Minister of Public Safety. I have two questions for the member from Malpeque. First of all, he seems to have read the bill, unlike his leader who says anything at all. But would he ask his leader to excuse himself, to apologize for having just attempted to mislead the House, saying that the bill changes the ways that guns would be transported? It doesn't change it. will he have the courage to tell the truth, Mr. Speaker? And the second thing is, what are we doing? Well, indeed, when hundreds of honest citizens find themselves in a situation where they're treated like criminals because they possess a weapon that has been reclassified just overnight, Mr. Speaker, yes, there are measures to ensure that that doesn't happen again. But why does the former Minister of Public Safety oppose the fact that honest people should remain honest and not find themselves being treated as criminals when they didn't break the law?
My goodness, did the minister not listen at all? Did the minister not listen at all? We said we support some of those aspects where they've got a 6-month clause to prevent them from being made criminals. In terms of the Swiss Army rifle, if that is what the minister was talking about, there was other ways of dealing with that issue. In fact, they're not made criminals yet because the minister was able to take action under the current laws that are in the land. He doesn't need to turn the whole issue on its head, Mr. Speaker, and take the authority for classifications of guns, prohibited, restricted, non-restricted guns in this country, away from the experts in the RCMP who certainly know what they're doing, and turn that authority over to a political base of advisors appointed by the minister, probably from the gun lobby itself, and give the minister the authority to make the final decision based on political favoritism, political pressure, and other things. That's the facts. And let me mention one other thing, Mr. Speaker, because the minister accused my leader of misleading the House. The individual who misled the House, Mr. Speaker, is the minister himself, and his comments right there. Here's what the minister's staff, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Minister of Public Safety rising on a point of order.
I do rise on a point of order, Mr. Speaker. Monsieur le Président, je voudrais...
Mr. Speaker, I would like to have a clarification, because when you don't tell the truth in the House of Commons, do you not mislead the House? If that's the case, I say clearly again that the leader of the second party attempted to mislead the House, and I demand that he apologize and that he retract. It's an important issue. We're not playing around with public safety and people's safety, and we don't mislead people, and we don't encourage people to behave dangerously. I want clarifications on this.
Again, I would just caution honourable members the use of the terms misleading the House. Members will know that if one adds some motive in that kind of a statement, or an intentional misleading has usually been referred to as being unparliamentary. So I recommend members avoid that kind of language, because it's very easy to cross that line. At the same time, the points that have been discussed here, I think, are in fact matters for debate, and I'm sure can come up in the fulsome time that we have, that the House has to debate the question that's before the House. We'll give the floor back to the honourable member for Malpeque.
Mr. Speaker, and we certainly wouldn't want to go beyond the parliamentary rules, but the fact of the matter is, during the briefing with the minister's staff from the minister's office on this particular bill, we received confirmation that easing the transportation regulations means that transport between locations other than those that are a condition of license will be possible with the passing of this bill. I think that opens up all kinds of problems, as the New Democratic member from Juan de Fuga, Esquimalt Juan de Fuga, said earlier in naming all the areas that under this bill you can transport weapons. Now it gets confusing. How can the police be sure that he's going between point A and point B? How can we be sure that with that gun, and yes, locked and no ammunition in the trunk, isn't stopped at a grocery store or a Canadian Tire or a service station getting gas? I mean, that's the risk, and the Minister of Public Safety is willing to accept that risk. That's wrong in the interest of...
We have a 10-minute period for questions and comments. We've got one question down so far, and we're about halfway through. Questions and comments? The honourable member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess you're not suggesting I take the whole 10 minutes. At the beginning, you know, I was pleased to see the minister staying for the debate, but I wonder, I'm going to ask the minister from Malpeque if he thinks like I do that perhaps his extreme agitation is because of the shaky ground he's standing on in this bill. We heard the minister during his remarks in the chamber promise to change the classification of 2 guns. And I wonder, as a former Solicitor General, if he's ever seen anything like this, where a minister makes a political promise in the House of Commons about the classification of weapons. And doesn't this really point to one of the severe problems in this bill, is the politicization of classifications?
Honourable member for Malpeque.
No question that it points to the politicization of classifications, and I am pleased to see the minister here, and I'm pleased to see him get on his feet and raise questions. I would hope that he would encourage his parliamentary secretary and the members in the committee to give us ample time to have the witnesses to do the proper hearings on the bill at committee. And I would hope that he rethinks overnight that maybe the bill should be split, so that we could get those elements that I think a number of us could agree on here. We might even get all-party agreement for once, Mr. Speaker, on those elements that would help law-abiding gun owners be a good thing, get it through fast, and then deal with those other issues that are a public safety concern. But the point I would make, I really find it remarkably strange when a Minister of the Crown in charge of the RCMP comes out with a press release as just an MP and puts it on the Conservative website and attacks the very people that he's supposed to be in charge of and minister of as unelected bureaucrats. Never seen it before, but it's not becoming of this minister.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Winnipeg North.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if the member might want to expand on the idea that the Liberal Party is advocating that the bill, in fact, be split into 2. I'm not overly optimistic given the government's tendency to bring in time allocation in order to force legislation through. But I'm wondering if he might provide some comment in terms of how it is that we would be able to have that quick passage of taking what's good in the bill and taking it and putting it to the side so it can actually pass, as he put it, before Christmas. And why would the government not want to do that?
It really would make you wonder why the government would want to do that. They claim to want to support law-abiding gun owners, farmers and hunters. This is their opportunity to do so. We have, my colleague would know that the leader of the party has a catchphrase: hope and hard work. We're willing to put the hard work in, and we hope that the government would come on side so that we could get those 5 points through by Christmas for the gun owners and farmers and hunters, Mr. Speaker. That would be a good thing, but we need more time on the other aspects. The politicization of the classification of guns, the transport of guns. We need more time to hear witnesses properly to ensure that the Canadian public and police officers in this country are safe as a result of these amendments, which I do believe will damage public safety in Canada.
Comments. Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I have to tell you, the member speech opposite has probably been one of the most entertaining activities I've seen in 14 years. He's a young man at heart, I know, but he should be careful about the kinds of contortions that he twists himself into. He may never be able to get himself straightened up again. He mentioned that they may have left the impression that they don't like gun owners. I wonder, Mr. Speaker, what could possibly have caused that impression? Perhaps the hated gun registry, or 20 years of refusing to amend it, or the refusal to ever reconsider that they might have done wrong. And now today they come here, Mr. Speaker, and they tell us that actually they don't believe in a gun registry anymore. This is a person who has taken at least 4 positions. He was for it when they brought it in. He was against it, he told us, but then he voted for it. And now today he says that he's against it. And so we've watched these kind of these kind of twists and turns. And I think probably one of the reasons he's speaking to us today is because he's one of the people that's most likely to change his mind again. This only makes sense, Mr. Speaker, and I'll finish up here quickly, if one thing's going to happen, and that is that the Liberals are going to go further than they did last time. Can he comment today as to whether they're actually going to go further next time and try to ban firearm ownership and confiscate firearms, if that's what they're really saying when they say we won't support a gun registry any longer?
Member for Malpeque.
What a line we're getting from the member, Mr. Speaker, who actually is probably as much responsible as the Minister for Agriculture for destroying the Canadian Wheat Board as a marketing institution in this country, and as we know, has cost farmers a great deal of money. And now we can't get any information on that wheat board. But that be as it may, Mr. Speaker, he can try and exaggerate all the stories he likes. I'm proud to have been here for 21 years. I have listened to the public. We know where the public is at on the gun registry. We've made it clear, our leader has made it clear that we're not going to bring back the gun registry. We want to ensure Canadians are safe, and we'll do that by other means. And no, we are not interested in banning guns in this country. So the member can get on with all the exaggeration he likes. We know they're really doing this for fundraising activities and to cater to that right-wing base that used to give them money, and they need a little more from it, and that's partly what this bill is all about. We believe in public safety in this party, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to speak out in the interests of, one, law-abiding gun owners and hunters, and we would like to pass those 5 recommendations there. And on the other side, we're going to speak out and ensure that there's public safety in this country and that guns are not an issue that will affect that.
Before we go to resuming a debate, I have the honour to inform the House that a communication has been received, which is as follows. Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to inform you that the Right Honourable David Johnson, Governor-General of Canada, signified royal assent by written declaration to the bill listed in the schedule to this letter on the 26th day of November 2014 at 3:41 p.m., and that's signed by Stephen Wallace. The bill assented to today, Wednesday, November 26, 2014, an act to implement the Free Trade Agreement between Canada and the Republic of Korea, Bill C-41.
And I have the honour to inform the House that a communication has been received. Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to inform you that the Right Honourable David Johnson, Governor-General of Canada, has given royal assent to the bill mentioned in a schedule to the present document on November 26, 2014 at 3:41 p.m. Sincerely, signed, Stephen Wallace. The bill having received royal assent on Wednesday, November 26, 2014, an act to implement the Free Trade Agreement between Canada and the Republic of Korea, Bill C-41, 41 rather.
Debate. The Honourable Member for Dauphin, Swan River, Marquette.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to be splitting my time with the member for Yorkton Melville, a member of Parliament who I consider a good friend, a mentor, and who I deeply respect for his work in preserving and retaining our hunting and angling and firearms traditions. And I'm proud to stand today in the House speaking in support of Bill C-42, the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act. I first want to comment on the comments by the member for Malpeque when he sneered at people who own firearms. I am chair of the Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus. Our caucus's mandate is to preserve and protect a way of life. That includes hunting, it includes angling, and is a strong measure of conservation. Hunting and angling groups are Canada's first and most effective conservation groups in the world. And I can see the members across laughing, but the waterfowl hunting community in North America created the North.
The honourable member for Malpeque.
Mr. Speaker, the member may want to misrepresent the House. We're not laughing over here, and no one smeared anglers and hunters. I'll not take that from that member opposite. If he wants to exaggerate, he can do it, but tell him to stick to the facts, if you would, Mr. Speaker.
Well, the member for Malpeque will know that, of course, the members, when they have their time, are free to make comments as long as they don't cross lines into unparliamentary language. There's a great degree of liberty that members can take. It's true that there is a standing order that asks members to avoid references to the absence or presence of members in the House. I don't know that that was necessarily what the member for Dauphin Small River Marquette was really getting at, but we'll let him continue. The honourable member, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. He was sneering at the people who hunt and fish in this country, and the members across and the NDP were laughing as well. I was making the point that the waterfowl hunting community.
The honourable member for Esquimalt-Juan-de-Fuca on the same point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, while a member may not breach a specific rule here, he's breaching the spirit of debate in the House and taking complete departure from reality of what's going on inside the House. I heard no one smear at hunters and fishers and no one laughing at him, but if he continues in this kind of way, it's going to undermine his credibility as a speaker completely, and it shows an immense disrespect for the House.
Well, again, we're back to a situation, I think, which actually underlines why the standing orders, in fact, ask members to avoid references to other members in the House, either their absence or presence. It really comes from the fact that characterizations of other members usually gets us into a spot in debate that we can quickly get to, for example, contravening the principles of, in particular, Article 18 of the Standing Orders, which really calls on honourable members to refer to other members in a respectful manner. And so these kinds of characterizations are really not very helpful, and I'd ask the honourable member for Dauphin Swan River to Marquette to be mindful of that in the course of his comments. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the way the member from Malpeque used the word gun lobby, that's obviously intended as an insult to the people who I represent in my constituency. And the gun lobby, so-called, are mothers and daughters and fathers and sons and uncles and aunts who hunt and fish in this country and who dedicate themselves to the conservation of our fish and wildlife resources. They want to narrow the debate, and we are enlarging it. As the chair of the Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus, I am traveling across the country, meeting with hunting, angling, and conservation groups right across this country. And to a group, Mr. Speaker, they are genuinely supportive of the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act and even more supportive of the conservation measures this government has brought in, such as the National Conservation Plan. And I'm making the point, Mr. Speaker, that because firearms owners, most of them are hunters, the act of hunting generates a spirit of conservation and a caring for the earth that they are actually attacking. They don't realize it. They think it's all about the guns. It's not. It's about a way of life. And many of us view the long gun registry and the comments from the members opposite, from the members of Malpeque, those are an attack on a way of life. And I know they don't want to think it that way. They want to narrow it down to an NRA, gun lobby kind of thing. That is so far from the truth. Our message from the Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus is resonating right across this country when we say, and we point out, and we prove that this party and this government and this Prime Minister and this Minister here are standing up for a way of life that millions of Canadians cherish. And we have the Recreational Fisheries Program, we have the National Conservation Plan, we have our National Areas Conservation Program, the Habitat Stewardship Program, and the most important program of all, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, a conservation plan 3 countries in scope, continent-wide, to conserve North America's waterfowl. And guess who supported, created, and funds that? North American hunters. And that's what my community does, and I'm so proud of them for what they do. And they were quite right in the early days of the long gun registry to realize that this was an egregious attack on that way of life. And that's what it really is. And the members opposite can bleat all they want. So, well, it's not about the hunting and angling. We really care about public safety. No, they don't. They are attacking a way of life because they don't like the people who participate in this way of life. And in Canada, there's 4 to 5 million people who hunt, fish, and trap. And it is our duty, at least on this side of the House, and again, I'm so proud to be chair of the Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus, and I'm proud to see the member from Yukon, my co-chair, former conservation officer, wildlife biologist, who deeply understands this way of life in the House today. So again, what the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Act does is help preserve and protect this way of life. We know that criminals are not licensed gun owners and that licensed gun owners are not criminals. But again, the logic of the old C-68 that the Liberal government put forward burdens people who are not criminals while letting criminals getting off. We see it how they vote, Mr. Speaker. Time and time again, they vote against our strong, tough-on-crime justice bills, looking for root causes. That's what they look for, root causes. You know what a root cause is, Mr. Speaker? Basically, when someone commits a crime, the root cause types look at those of us who are law-abiding citizens and work hard and own property. They basically say, well, it's your fault. You're the person and the group who made this root cause that caused the criminal to commit the crime. Well, on this side of the House, we know that criminals commit crimes because they're not good people. It's as simple as that, Mr. Speaker, and that is common sense. Now, again, what was really interesting is that when we eliminated the long gun registry, the crime rate actually fell. And in fact, the year after the registry was abolished, gun crime in Toronto decreased by over 80%. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm not here today to claim that these two things are necessarily linked. In fact, it's precisely the opposite. It proves empirically that measures that make left-wing politicians, like all of them across the way there, feel like they are tackling crime and are generally not worth the paper they are printed on. Now, there's more directly to address the matter that is before us today. As I said, as chair of the Conservative Hunting and Angling Caucus, I travel across the country. I meet with wildlife associations, rod and gun clubs, and everyday ordinary hunters. And without exception, the first problem that I hear when we talk about federal firearms legislation is that there was no common sense. Well, we're bringing common sense in. And it is clear that the early laws drafted by the Liberals were crafted by someone who couldn't tell a rifle from a shotgun. Let me tell you about the Manitoba Wildlife Federation, what they had to say about this bill. They said, we support smart, cost-effective firearms policy that keeps Canadians safe, but treats gun owners fairly. We applaud the Conservative government's ongoing efforts to streamline firearms licensing in Canada to make it more effective and efficient. Now, this one is very interesting. Pardon my Manitoba High School French, but the Fédération Québécoise de Chasseurs et Pêcheurs, the Quebec Hunting and Fishing Federation, and this is a quote from them, is thrilled with this initiative. Wow. Quebec hunters are very pleased with this bill, and this is a quote, because it simplifies the license issuing process for law-abiding users while reinforcing the concepts of safety and education. That's a quote. And, Mr. Speaker, there are 575,000 Quebecers who own firearms and enjoy hunting. We are going to make sure that every one of those law-abiding Quebec firearm owners and hunters knows exactly what is in this bill, and we think that they will react accordingly. The Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, 100,000 strong. The changes proposed by this government strike a balance between the need to remove administrative burdens on legal law-abiding firearms owners in Canada and government's intention to protect and enhance public safety. In our opinion, they have succeeded on both counts. So we have quotes from from the hunting and angling and conservation groups right across the country. So this notion that the member from Malpeque says that there's some kind of narrow base that we're appealing to is utter nonsense. These are regular, common folk who know something bad when they see it and are applauding our government's efforts to protect and preserve the grassroots hunting and, of course, the angling traditions in this country. A quick word on the authorization to transport. That applies only to restricted and prohibited firearms. The member opposite, the member from Malpeque, clearly doesn't understand the difference between firearms. When the reclassification happened as well, the Swiss Arms and CZ rifles were reclassified simply because how they looked, not because of what they did. They were semi-automatic firearms, and semi-automatic. I own semi-automatic firearms, and other people in this room do as well. So they were reclassified because of how they looked, not what they did. Nobody is proposing that any restricted firearms ever be legalized like fully automatic firearms. I certainly would not support that. In terms of the ATT, every single time that a law-abiding shooter went to the range, they had to get a permit every single day. Now we've made it so once they get there, the first ATT, it's good. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Gatineau. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very interesting for a speech, sometimes rather odd, but what
Mr. Speaker, from this speech, I tend to want to say to my esteemed colleague in front of me is that C-42 is anything but a tough on crime bill. Anything but. But my question is more about, I kind of sense that even their base is starting to feel a bit used and abused by these attempts to always parade them when they bring anything that is gun-related. And I just want to quote something to him, because somebody was saying, some party stalwarts were saying that they're starting to feel taken for granted. And I'm quoting Dennis Young, who's a former RCMP officer, who was the Reform Party's regional coordinator for Manitoba, Saskatchewan in the 90s, and then spent 13 years in Ottawa as an aide to one Conservative MP. Recently, when called by a Conservative fundraiser at his home, Young told him not to bother calling back until the Public Safety Minister responded to his letter about Bill C-42. He said he was miffed that after all his work for the Conservatives, he had received no real answer to his question. It all leaves us feeling a bit like we're just being used for fundraising. If they have that attitude, they're going to be disappointed. So when he talks about tough on crime legislation, how does he respond to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs from Quebec who said, ça va à l'encontre du concept de la...
This flies in the face of the concept of public safety and the safety of citizens.
In Swan River, Marquette.
Well, I'm not surprised for a minute that the member opposite would find my speech odd. She has no understanding of what I was talking about. I'm talking about, well, I expect all of them to find my speech odd. The notion of hunters and anglers and families enjoying the outdoor life as a family group with friends and eating wild game and understanding what conservation is all about. Of course that's odd to them. Now, in terms of the public safety aspect of the bill, and of course she referred to Mr. Young. I understand. I know him personally. Nothing is perfect in this world. In fact, the perfect is the enemy of the good. This is a very, very good bill. In terms of public safety, we're strengthening the provisions relating to orders prohibiting the possession of firearms or a person that's convicted of an offense involving domestic violence. We are going to import information sharing when restricted or prohibited firearms into Canada. So this bill strikes the right balance between ensuring needless paperwork is eliminated and the rights of law-abiding citizens are protected and the protection of public safety.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Trinity Spadina.
I rise to ask a question about the common sense component of this bill, except that when I started to read it, the only place it's actually mentioned is in the introduction. There's actually no common sense in the bill. which is kind of interesting. But the question I have is this, and it's a very simple one for the minister. I'm trying to figure out, and I guess the House needs to know, how allowing people to drive around cities, where I assume no hunting is being done, we have some big raccoons, but they're really not that dangerous, but how driving around a city with a gun in your trunk is a safe thing to do. Cars are stolen, and we've had reported and repeated incidents of people being followed home from gun ranges and having those people robbed. How is allowing guns, and how does allowing guns driving around a city more easily make cities safer? I'm not speaking for the 4 or 5 legal gun owners who are law-abiding citizens. I'm talking for the 26 million people who don't own guns, many of whom will live in those cities, and many of them are looking to the government to make their cities safe from the illegal use of guns, in particular assault rifles.
Honourable Member for Dauphin, Swan River, Marquette.
Well, under our watch in Toronto, gun crime is down 80%. That result speaks for itself. In terms of the authorization to transport, often called an ATT, it applies to prohibited and restricted firearms. Now, a criminal will never register a handgun. A law-abiding citizen will. A criminal will never apply for an ATT. A law-abiding citizen will. By streamlining the process, so once the owner of a restricted firearm who is legally authorized to own it gets an ATT, that person is allowed to use that over the time period that their license goes for. I think that's strictly common sense, and I think we can safely see the gun crime rate in Toronto continue to go down. Now, the knife crime rate in Toronto keeps going up. Now, perhaps we can ask the members opposite to help us with our tough on crime policies, but I doubt it.
Before we resume debate in the honourable member for Yorkton Melville, I'll let him know that there's actually only 5 minutes remaining in the time permitted for government orders today. However, he will know that he'll have that 5 minutes and, of course, the remaining 5 minutes when the House next resumes debate on this question. So we'll get started anyway for 5 minutes. The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And 5 minutes is hardly enough time for me to go over all the things I'd like to go over, but I will begin and finish it another day. I'm really pleased to be able to rise and discuss the Common Sense Firearms Licensing Bill. I'm pleased to see the government is standing up for the rights of law-abiding Canadians who enjoy and use firearms. As you know, Mr. Speaker, I've been fighting for the rights of law-abiding hunters, farmers, and sport shooters for 2 decades now. I fought the introduction of the wasteful and ineffective long gun registry from the time it was introduced by Alan Rock under the previous Liberal government, and I was proud to stand in this place 2 years ago and support and pass the Ending the Long Gun Registry Act. The gun registry was the epitome of political pretense. It pretended to protect us by reducing crime, but in fact, it did just the opposite. A long and short of it is that criminals don't register their guns and they don't obey laws. And it was about time people realized that spending $2 billion of taxpayers' money to keep a list of property of individuals predisposed to obey the law was not a good use of resources. And equally, I'm glad to see that this bill today takes strong measures to focus the use of resources on that which actually prevents crime, rather than simply seeking to disarm Canadians. This legislation will streamline licensing and eliminate needless red tape for responsible gun owners, and it's something that I have advocated for many years. In fact, some measures in Bill C-42 also can be found in my 2009 private members bill C-301. They're housekeeping items that will simplify procedures without reducing public safety. Items like merging the possession-only license with a possession and acquisition license, for instance, or making the authorization to transport a restricted firearm, more commonly known as ATT, a condition of a restricted license. Let me explain for those in the House who are less familiar with firearms regulation what an ATT is. An ATT is a document that specifies where a licensed restricted firearm owner may take their property. It may contain a variety of locations, or it may be very specific. This is dependent on the whim of the provincial chief firearms officer. It's not in legislation. If travel to a location outside of those previously approved is needed, more forms must be filled out and more approval must be sought. Some may say that this level of rigor is needed, as restricted firearms could be dangerous in the wrong hands. But the fact of the matter is that those with restricted firearms licenses get a background check every day. And the application for an authorization to transport isn't even shared with local law enforcement. It's the definition of wasteful paperwork. And it's frustrating for me to sit here and listen to people talk about this thing when they know very little about it. And hopefully, if we get to questions and comments, I can explain more about the lack of knowledge here in regards to this issue. The government trusts a restricted license holder to have a restricted firearm in their home. They should trust them to travel to appropriate locations to use the firearm. Some have said that this will allow for conceal and carry by the back door. Absolutely false. All safe transport requirements remain in place, such as unloading the firearm, renting it inoperable, and placing it in a locked case. The logic that these ATTs, which are not shared with law enforcement, will somehow reduce crime is the same logic put forward by those who think that registering a firearm will somehow reduce crime. At the end of the day, violent crimes committed with firearms are committed by evil people with evil intentions. No amount of paperwork or regulation will divert them from their path of wanton destruction. What will stop them is being incarcerated for a lengthy period of time, and this is why we passed mandatory prison sentences for those who commit crimes with firearms. And we created a specific offense for drive-by shootings. These measures truly increase public safety and reduce the cost of crime. That is what we're focusing on, tackling those who are predisposed to break the law rather than those who are simply trying to enjoy a way of life that has been part of Canada's heritage since Confederation. The focus on safe and sensible firearms policy is why this bill amends the criminal code to establish firearms prohibition orders for those convicted of domestic violence. Once this bill is passed, those convicted of serious domestic violence offenses, which include offenses against a spouse, common law partner, or dating partner, will be subject to a mandatory prohibition from owning restricted or prohibited firearms and from owning long guns for a minimum of 10 years. I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the time. I'm sorry I had to split this bill and speak to it at a later date, but I look forward to some healthy debate in this House because there are some serious misconceptions which need to be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
And the honourable member for Yorkton Melville will indeed have another 5 minutes when the House next takes up debate, and of course the usual 5 minutes for questions and comments.